Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Nothing surprises God. There's never a moment when he's caught off guard or finds himself asking, how did that happen? And we're going to see that truth lived out in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 1 through 13. As God reveals his plan for the cities of sanctuary that were to be established by the Israelites once they entered the land of Canaan. God was preparing for future events long before they ever happened. He was lovingly protecting his people from unknowingly committing a sin. The Israelites were only human, and God knew that they would be prone to act according to their emotions. He knew the land of promise was going to be filled with people who could and would hurt one another, even kill one another. So he had Moses provide them with his plan for the inevitable, so that they would not do the unthinkable. When the Lord your God cuts off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourselves in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall measure the distances and divide into 3 parts the area of the land that the Lord your God gives you as a possession, so that any manslayer can flee to them. This is the provision for the manslayer, who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, he may flee to one of these cities and live. Lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. Therefore I command you, you shall set apart 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he has sworn to your fathers, and gives you all the land that he promised to give to your fathers, provided you are careful to keep all this commandment, which I command you today, by loving the Lord your God and by walking ever in his ways, then you shall add 3 other cities to these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and so the guilt of bloodshed be upon you. But if anyone hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him, and attacks him and strikes him fatally so that he dies, and he flees into one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and take him from there, and hand him over to the avenger of blood so that he may die. Your eye shall not pity him, but you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, so that it may be well with you. Deuteronomy 19, verses 1 through 13. God cares. That's an extremely important theological insight that we too often overlook. Deism is a theological theory which views God as distant and disengaged from the world he created. He is seen as the creator, but according to deism, he takes a hands-off approach when it comes to the management of his creation, allowing mankind the autonomy to determine its own fate. But as this passage will clearly reveal, this view of God is far from biblical. The image of God gleaned from a reading of the Scriptures is quite different. He's not the giant clockmaker in the sky who wound up his creation and then left it to slowly wind its way into oblivion. No, the God of the Bible is fully engaged with his creation, and he is intimately involved in the lives of those who worship him. This section of the book of Deuteronomy contains a series of admonitions from Moses to the people of Israel as he attempts to prepare them for their conquest of the land of Canaan. Much of what he is telling them is repetitive in nature. He's simply reminding them of their God-ordained responsibilities and challenging them to take the commands of God seriously, because God cares. Their actions and attitudes matter to God. The way they live their lives is important to God because they are his representatives on this earth, bearing his name and intended to bring him glory. So Moses reminds the Israelites that upon entering the land of Canaan that God had given them as an inheritance, they were to set apart 6 cities within the territory as places of refuge. Even before they had stepped over the border into the land and fought their first battle, God provided a system designed to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. God knew his people well, and he was fully aware that their sinful dispositions would cause them to engage in a wide range of unacceptable behaviors. That's why he had provided them with his law as a black and white compendium of rules to live by. He had also given them the sacrificial system as a means of receiving atonement for the sins they would inevitably commit. Again, because he cared for them. And when it came to the topic of murder, God had been quite specific. Whoever strikes someone so that he dies must surely be put to death, But if he does not do it with premeditation, but it happens by accident, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks his neighbor to kill him cunningly, you will take him even from my altar that he may die. Exodus 21, verses 12 through 14. God was and is opposed to murder, the taking of innocent life, but he provided his people with much needed legal clarification establishing the difference between premeditated murder and involuntary manslaughter. An important factor behind all of this was the law of retribution, or what has come to be known as lex talionis. The familiar phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is wrapped up in this law, and it was part of the Israelite judicial system, as outlined in the Mosaic Law. But if there is serious injury, then you will give a life for a life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Exodus 21, verses 23 through 25. The principle behind this system of justice was that the punishment must match the crime. It involved the concept of just retribution, and was to be administered under a strict judicial system designed to see to it that proper steps were taken to ensure justice was meted out. Lex talionis was never intended to be some kind of vigilante justice system where people took the law into their own hands. So in the case of murder, God provided the Israelites with a way to keep them from following one form of injustice with another. As the saying goes, accidents happen. God knew that there were going to be those occasions where a life was taken unintentionally. He even gave an example. Suppose he goes with someone else to the forest to cut wood, and when he raises the axe to cut the tree, the axe head flies loose from the handle and strikes his fellow worker so hard that he dies. The person responsible may flee to one of these cities to save himself. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. No premeditation, no malice. But according to lex talionis, the relatives of the one murdered could demand a life for a life. They could seek retribution. They were even responsible by law to see that the life of the relative was avenged. But God was determined to keep his people from allowing their passion for justice to result in an even greater sin. You must not shed innocent blood in your land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, for that would make you guilty. Deuteronomy 19, verse 10. The cities of refuge were set apart by God for the express purpose of providing a safe haven for anyone who happened to commit involuntary manslaughter. It was going to happen, and God made provision for it. He knew his people well enough, and he loved them deeply enough, to provide them with a well-designed system for ensuring that justice was done. God was not, and still is not, some distant deity, unconcerned and uninvolved in the daily affairs of life. He is a God who cares and who intimately interacts with his creation. The level of detail involved in his law reveals just how well God knew the people of Israel. He left nothing up to chance. Even the cities of refuge are an illustration of just how deeply God cares about his people. He knew that his laws, while just, righteous, and holy, could be twisted and abused by his people. So he provided clarification and installed safeguards to ensure that one sin did not lead to another. Life is important to God, which is why he provided a law against murder. But God also puts a high priority on justice. Those committing premeditated murder were to be dealt with quickly and severely. But God's justice is always balanced by his desire for mercy. So he made provision for those who found themselves guilty of shedding innocent blood accidentally. Ultimately, this was all about the integrity of God's name. The people of Israel were his chosen people, responsible for acting as his representatives on earth. And their actions would either glorify or bring shame to his reputation, which is why he left nothing up to chance. He cared enough to create a plan for any and all scenarios the Israelites might encounter along the way. And Moses told them the motivation behind God's actions, so that it may go well with you. Deuteronomy 19, verse 13.